To you, Amy. Whoops, sorry guys. Got our recording in progress notice. I am here to introduce to you Amy Hammerman and Mandy Hagseth. And let me first tell you about Amy. Amy is a full-time feminist and homemaker, a community organizer, and an activist. Amy is the Missouri State Policy Advocate for NCJW. She is also a member of Congregation Share Emeth. Where she serves as the co-chair of the Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. She's an attorney on extended hiatus with experience practicing family law in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Amy graduated from Stanford with a degree in political science and feminist studies. Let's see. Amy also graduated from the University of California College of Law. She is a proud Taiwanese and Japanese Jewish American who lives in St. Louis with her very supportive and patient husband, two budding activist sons, all right, and a spoiled canine daughter. Then let's move on to Maggie Hagseth with over 15 years of experience in health, rights, and justice. She serves as the Director of Policy and External Affairs at the Missouri Family Health Council. She's held various roles there since joining the organization in 2017. Previously, Mandy managed a diverse portfolio of social justice coalitions as the Director of Community Collaboratives at Community Partnership of the Ozarks in Springfield, Missouri. She has also worked on reproductive and maternal health initiatives in the Dakotas and served as the Upper Midwest Human Rights Fellow to the UN Women Country Office of Liberia. Mandy holds an undergraduate and law degree from the University of South Dakota. I turn it over to you, ladies.
Excellent. Should I go ahead and just dig in? Okay. Great. Well, so much to talk about today. Thank you all so much for joining us. As Nicole said, I am Mandy Hagseth. I am happy to be here and even happier for the amazing partnership that Missouri Family Health Council holds with the National Council of Jewish Women St. Louis. Through Jen, Heather, Amy, Ellen, and many others, we have had a fantastic partnership over many years that extends beyond, but including our legislative collaboration and work. So I'm going to kick us off by kind of talking about sort of the key issues under sort of the Women, Children, and Families banner, specifically reproductive and sexual health care. Missouri Family Health Council, for those that are not familiar, we administer the Title X Federal Family Planning Program and a state-based contraceptive equity initiative called The Right Time. So we champion access to reproductive and sexual health education and services. So I think the big headline, we'll start with something positive, because as you all know, with the Missouri State Legislature, especially in the issues that we all know and care deeply about, it's not often good news. And so we'll start on a really positive note with, I think, the big positive headline, which is postpartum extension in Medicaid finally passed. And I know that many of you contributed to the effort over many years. And so what this does, it takes current coverage, which ends at 60 days, to 1 year. And so it extends in that period that we know is particularly problematic with very preventable maternal health challenges and maternal death. And so this was the culmination of many years of advocacy from a diverse group of stakeholders like yourselves. And it really all but passed last year, but for some sort of kind of political conflict. And so it really should have passed last year, and it unfortunately did not make it across the finish line. But thankfully, this year it did. And it wasn't actually a really seamless process this year either. And so it was even more celebratory that multiple bills extending this coverage got across the finish line. So if you take nothing away positively away from today, the big, I think, headline under the Women, Children, and Families banner is that postpartum Medicaid coverage has been extended in Missouri. And we definitely expect that the governor will sign at least one, if not multiple of the vehicles that passed on. So that is probably the biggest positive headline. I would also just mention under kind of the maternal child health banner that there were a couple of bills that added doula and midwifery care in insurance coverage that had a lot of support, bipartisan support. Unfortunately, they did not fully pass, but they did advance in the process, and we would expect that they would probably have an expedited review in an upcoming session. So that was also kind of part of that specifically Black maternal health conversation as well. Under birth control, so Missouri Family Health Council has collaborated deeply with National Council of Jewish Women St. Louis on what we call our annual supply birth control bill. What this bill does is, yes, I see some nods, familiarity. So this is the 5th year of this legislation. And what this bill does, it seeks to require insurance companies that already cover birth control to cover and fund a year-long supply at a time. That is opposed to the regular, 90-day supply or 3-month supply that is typical. So we did enjoy a momentary positive blip in this issue during this session. It definitely didn't pass, so I don't want to inflate overconfidence. But even though we didn't get a public hearing on the bill this year, Patty Lewis, Representative Patty Lewis, who was a first-time sponsor in the Missouri House, she successfully attached this bill onto, as it turned out, one of the postpartum bills. But at that time, there were other things being attached to it, kind of what happens later in session. But she successfully got the bill amended onto a bill, and it was there for a while until it was removed in the conference committee. But this actually is celebratory because it marks the furthest in the process that this bill technically has gotten. So in its 5 years, it's only received 1 public hearing, which was last year. And then this year, having been attached and existing, the possibility of it advancing, existing briefly was a really celebratory moment. And I will tell you that even though it was removed from the postpartum bill for a couple of different reasons, we did get a lot of conversation started, and we got some really good commitments from a couple of different, particularly Republican House and Senate members about their interest and commitment to work on this issue next year. So not only did it raise the profile of the issue, but we did get some buy-in, I think, that we can really capitalize on moving forward. So I'm starting with some positive things here, because especially as I pass it over to Amy, we'll talk about some of the less celebratory and very negative things that occurred as well. And then the only other thing I think worth mentioning under the birth control banner, so Missouri Family Health Council has kind of a triad of proactive contraceptive access bills that we have started promoting for the last couple of years, of which annual supply birth control is number 1. But we also have championed a bill that's been around for a great many years called the CARE Act. It's the Compassionate Assistance in Rape Emergencies. And it's an emergency contraception being made more available and dispensed within emergency rooms. And I think Stacey Newman carried this bill for many years, but now Representative Ian Mackey has championed it. Though here again, the bill did not receive a public hearing. Representative Mackey did raise the issue very briefly in the House Judiciary Committee and attempted to try to amend it onto another bill. The amendment did fail, but the bill was still, he was kind of keeping the conversation and the dialogue at least a little bit alive. And that also allowed an entry point for us to initiate some additional conversations about the importance of this issue. And so it's maybe not even a victory, but a small victory at that I also just wanted to mention under the birth control banner, that, especially after the Dobbs ruling overturning Roe v. Wade, we were extremely concerned about proactive attacks on contraception. And though we thankfully did not see any of those, we also did not see an appetite to increase access in the way that we thought we might in the wake of Dobbs. But the annual supply birth control bill being attached briefly, and then the conversation about emergency contraception were both still positive and kind of kept these issues at the forefront in some way, in a positive, proactive way. So of course, under the birth control banner, there's no shortage of anti-abortion bills that were either introduced or that even advanced. There were a good handful, even in the handful of final weeks of session, that received public hearings. Some that sought to enshrine the lack of support for abortion rights in the Missouri Constitution. Senator Mike Moon had sort of a fetal personhood, and I think it's called the Abolition of Abortion in Missouri Act. Of course, we know that abortion is already unlawful in the state. And then just a smattering of other anti-abortion bills. Thankfully, for the most part, none of those, though they did advance, none of them passed. The only thing under this banner that did pass is what we at Missouri Family Health Council kind of refer to as the free choice of provider in Medicaid provision. This is something, AKA defunding Planned Parenthood. I'm sure many of you have followed this over the years. This is actually a bit of a silly outcome. Just in December, again, for the second time, Missouri courts have said putting these prohibitions in budget bills in the state legislature is unconstitutional. Yet they did it again. And so in two different budget bills, those that are around health, there was a kind of defunding Planned Parenthood provision that was included. So we know it's unconstitutional. If the state chooses to enforce the provision or refuse reimbursements to Planned Parenthood again, they will lose, because we have been through this before. And just to be clear on this issue, because I know that it swirls around and we talk about it in different ways, but this is for Medicaid reimbursement for non-abortion services. That's like your cancer screenings, your well people exams, your birth control. So this is the state of Missouri in different ways, this way through the budget, saying that patients cannot choose if they have MoHealthNet coverage or are on Medicaid, that they cannot go to Planned Parenthood for non-abortion services. That is a violation of federal Medicaid law. And the state of Missouri has said that it is unconstitutional in a similar way to legislate through the budget process. And so it was a little dumbfounding that they included that yet again, especially after this sort of reiteration of its unconstitutionality just in December. But it would depend on how the enforcement would play out. It is noteworthy, though, that there were standalone defund provisions, both a statute and a constitutional amendment that would have been referred to the ballot that did not advance. But were introduced. They did advance, excuse me, they did advance through the process. They did not pass. And so the only anti-abortion measure that fully passed were those defund provisions in the budget. And so that is a tremendous victory based on volume and just the temperature in general. Before I turn it over to Amy, I would just mention two additional sort of public health or women, children, and family oriented or adjacent positive things that passed. One, we work closely with the Missouri Nurses Association on advanced practice registered nurse regulatory reduction, because we have about 70 to 80 APRNs in our family planning provider network across the state, and we want them to be able to practice at the top of their licensure. Missouri Nurses Association has worked for several years with other partners, and possibly some of you as well, to reduce some of those regulations, especially after the pandemic, where some of them were temporarily relaxed. They did get a couple of things across the finish line this year. There was a full scope of practice, a couple of full scope of practice bills that were out there, but compromise language was required. And so at the end of the day, it's still the most significant changes, I think, in years. And it includes some mileage restrictions for telehealth being removed, 30-day preceptorship requirement being changed, and also removing some limitations where APRNs can only practice telehealth services in rural areas of need, among others. There's other provisions too. But this is still a really positive thing that a lot of people had worked on for many years. So it is increasing access to care, especially as we're concerned in the reproductive and sexual health field or in family planning as well. And then one other thing that passed that I think is really positive in kind of this space, there was a bill that essentially sought to remove a cost sharing requirement for a second mammogram. So if you have a first mammogram and they see something, they want to take a deeper look, sometimes insurance companies would require different amounts of patient cost sharing depending on their plans. And so there was a bill that was attached to kind of a larger health omnibus bill that disallowed for that, or requires like that second diagnostic mammogram to be fully covered by insurance. And so that is also positive. And I think very positive in the conversation about annual supply birth control too, because we're talking about things that insurance companies should be doing for positive reasons that also ultimately reduce later costs and enhance preventive care. So those are kind of the sexual and reproductive health bill notes in an overview. I think we're going to do some questions maybe at the end, but if none now, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Amy to talk about the whole host of other issues that you all care about, and unfortunately, some of the more negative things that were done during this session. But thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Mandy. So Mandy led with our good news, and I'll have maybe a little bit more good news sprinkled throughout the way, but kind of spinning off of our discussion regarding healthcare, you've probably seen in the news all of the anti-transgender legislation that has been sort of permeating our culture across the country, and notably in Missouri. I believe our legislature was second in the nation for the highest number of anti-trans bills filed this year. And while a great many of them did not pass, unfortunately, two specific bills did pass. So I'll go over them. The first is I'll talk about is an anti-transgender affirming healthcare bill. And to clarify what's considered under this umbrella of gender affirming healthcare, that depends on the age of the child. What was specifically out and will include things like mental health therapy, things as basic as changing your name and your pronouns and wearing different clothes. But what has been now outlawed with some limitations are medical interventions. And to be clear, for minors, these primarily consist of medications like puberty blockers, which are admittedly not used just for gender affirming healthcare. They are used for a host of reasons, including among them early onset of puberty in cisgendered kids, for example. It would also include hormone therapy, and in very, very rare circumstances, surgery. And when I say rare, I say like something less than 2% of minors have any kind of surgery for their gender affirming care. That is now, any of those forms of healthcare are now prohibited in Missouri starting August. The compromise that was made was to include a sunset provision. So currently this law is due to take effect in August and will be in effect for 4 years unless the legislature decides to change that. Also, any minors who are currently receiving any of these forms of gender affirming medical care are allowed to continue to receive that care. So they will not be forcibly detransitioned. Unfortunately, this does mean that a number of minors who either don't get in to start any of these treatments before August, or are frankly too young for any of these treatments, they will not have access within the state of Missouri. Despite the fact that the sort of rallying cry for this legislation has been the protection of children, this bill also prohibits gender affirming care for anyone in the state of Missouri who is currently incarcerated. And while people don't generally have much sympathy for folks who are in prison, we do have to keep in mind that once you have imprisoned someone, they only have one healthcare option. And that is now not available to them. Also, if you are a trans person in Missouri who is a participant in Mo HealthNet, our Medicaid healthcare insurance program, your care, gender affirming care, will also no longer be covered effective August. So contrary to what they try to say, this does affect adults, and it betrays sort of a deeper a deeper cause for passage of this legislation. I thought I would touch briefly on a non-legislative piece regarding transgender healthcare. Our Missouri Attorney General attempted to pass regulations in Missouri under a consumer protection law that would have effectively made it impossible for most trans people to access healthcare. It would have imposed onerous requirements, including but not limited to having a diagnosis of gender dysphoria for at least three years. But it would also have required that any other underlying mental health concerns be resolved. But the problem is, if you have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, often what is in that diagnosis are things like depression, anxiety, which are other mental health concerns that have to be resolved. So this regulation would have really put a lot of people in a no-win situation. That said, the Attorney General was smacked down several times in St. Louis County Court, and he just yesterday, I believe, withdrew that regulation. So it has made that moot. I think the reason why I bring this up is because just to highlight the fact that a lot of these bills, while they proclaim a care for people and protection of people, what we have seen is it goes beyond just protecting children. It goes beyond just trying to protect people from bad consumer practices. There is an underlying anti-trans movement that is being used for political purposes. And when those political purposes no longer suit them, they are immediately dropped. Sorry, I told myself I wasn't going to curse during this, so those of you who are going to take breath, I needed a breath. Okay. In regards to other bills that we worked on, there was also, in regards to anti-trans legislation, first we started years ago with bathroom legislation. They then moved on to banning minor trans children from or trans athletes from participating in the sports according to their gender identity. Originally, the notion was that we shouldn't allow, we need to protect kids. That was the rallying cry. That said, the legislation that passed applies from kindergarten through the collegiate level, and it bans athletes from participating in sports according that conform with their own gender identity. It applies to public schools and private schools and charter schools. It is a little up in the air over whether or not this can actually apply to private institutions, but regardless, that is what the legislation says. Moreover, it applies to collegiate athletes, and I imagine the NCAA will have something to say about that shortly. We're not in the business of telling kids that your 8-year-old, we shouldn't be in the business of telling your 8-year-old that they can't play on this team that they should be playing on or want to be playing on. And that is exactly what this legislation does. At the moment, for both of those anti-trans bills, they are sitting on the governor's desk. We are encouraging everyone to call and email Governor Parson to express your desire for him to veto these bills. Realistically, the governor is going to sign these bills. He did threaten to call a special session to pass these bills if they weren't done before Friday of last week. That said, it is extremely important for those of us who believe in human rights, who believe in trans rights, but more sort of overarching that, who believe in human rights, to speak out and let the governor know that this is not acceptable to us. I feel like I should tell you something good. So the bad news is that we had the most extreme Don't Say Gay bill, or the Don't Say Gay bill in the nation. It was a bill that would have prohibited school personnel, teachers, faculty, and staff from discussing sexual orientation or gender identity with students in schools. Unlike Florida's, which did pass, that went only through the 3rd grade, the sponsors of these bills in Missouri were very proud of the fact that it would have extended all the way through high school, which begs the question of how on earth do you do sex ed in high school if you're not allowed to talk about sexual orientation and gender identity. Mostly through senatorial infighting, that bill did not pass. It was part of a broader bill referred to as the Parents' Bill of Rights that would have also imposed numerous transparency requirements upon teachers, things like making curriculum available to parents, requiring teachers to post and provide their curriculum 6 months in advance. And we heard from educators across the state that is, frankly, first of all, that we don't really have a transparency problem in our state. School districts by and far are very good about providing that information to parents when they want it, if not just freely on their websites if they have them. And moreover, that's not how teachers work. If something comes up that is worth discussing in a classroom, they should not be prohibited from doing it just because they didn't provide it in their curriculum 6 months ago. So thankfully that didn't pass. I imagine that they will take another stab at this next session. There was another Parents' Bill of Rights bill that would have been similar in that, except that rather than attacking gender orientation, gender identity and sexual orientation, it would have prohibited or attempted to prohibit CRT, or so-called critical race theory, which is a fairly esoteric field primarily taught in advanced college level classes and in law school. It has been sort of popularized as this notion of teaching history and social studies in a way that makes certain groups of people feel bad about that history. I believe at least one of the bills specifically called out curriculum or prohibiting teaching things like the 1619 Project, and even as far as prohibiting any materials produced by the organization We Stories, which I believe has morphed, but it is an organization that was founded in St. Louis that really just provides multicultural books to families. So thankfully that also did not pass. And I would like to say that was because of our very hard work, but frankly, it's because the legislators were really more focused on persecuting trans folks and they just didn't get around to it. So we might see that again next year. I guess a good bit of news is that a bill that would have made it more difficult to pass initiative petitions in the state of Missouri did not pass. The bill that we were fighting would have increased the threshold for passing a ballot initiative from a simple majority, so 50% plus one vote, up to 57% of the vote. We have seen in Missouri that the initiative petition process has been crucial for protection of our democracy, for people to have access to the democratic process. We passed Medicaid expansion through the ballot initiative process. We passed medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, for that matter, through the ballot initiative process. We stopped some pretty severe anti-labor policies through that process. The leader of the Speaker of the House sort of let the cat out of the bag, and as to the reason why they wanted to increase the threshold, and that is because Missouri is in the process of possibly putting putting on a ballot initiative to reinstate access or the right to abortion in our state. And they wanted to make that more difficult. Luckily, they were not able to pass that. It will probably come up again next year, but frankly, it is not an issue that it tends to be popular with the people of Missouri. It's the show me state. We want to be involved in our democracy. So all the more reason to let your legislators know you do not support their attempts to take away your access to the legislative process. Let's see. I know we have a lot of folks in our organization are very concerned about book banning that's happening in Missouri. Because most of us know from history, anywhere they start banning books, it's a pretty bad road for marginalized communities. And that would include the Jewish community and people of color. The Secretary of State regulation that would defund libraries for not banning books is still in litigation. There was an attempt by the Missouri House to potentially strip funding from all libraries in the state of Missouri, primarily in retaliation to two library associations suing against the regulation that would require them to ban books. Luckily, the Senate did see some reason and restored that funding. That said, who knows what will happen next year, and it's always important if this is something that is important to you. And we see it as a matter of democracy for people to have access to public libraries. You can also contact your legislators to let them know you don't want to see this come back next year. I will say in regards to progress made on gun violence, we did testify in support of a bill that would allow judges to prohibit firearm possession and purchase by people who have had a restraining order issued against them. So this is a provision that is available, I believe, in 30 some odd states in the nation, where if a judge has determined that you're sufficiently dangerous, more likely than not to commit violence or abuse of another person, to have a restraining order against you, you should also not have a firearm. We currently don't have that. And what we also know is that the most dangerous period in a domestic or intimate partner violence situation is the immediate period when someone is trying to separate out of that relationship. And so it makes common sense not to allow the abuser to have guns. And I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, but sadly, a great many women are killed by gun violence when they are trying to extricate themselves from these relationships. We're proud to work with Representative Del Taylor, who's a freshman representative in the Missouri House from the St. Louis area. He was able to get a hearing on this. And while we fielded a lot of questions about the implications on people's Second Amendment rights, I think we did see some understanding of the fact that domestic violence is a problem and gun violence is a problem. And this would be a fairly simple and common sense measure to take in order to reduce the risk of that violence. So from our perspective, that is a really good first step in reducing gun violence in Missouri. Other than that, I think I've covered the bulk of what we worked on this session, although I'm happy for Jen and Heather to fill in just in case I've forgotten anything, but I feel like I've talked for a really long time. So I'm also happy to move on to questions as well.
You mean that's it? No, joking. No, you
Well,
you pretty much
NCJW, we do abortion and trans rights and guns. What's hard about that?
right.
Amy, it's Cheryl from JCRC. I'm triggered just listening to it all. Some of it I had already buried away. It's now back.
Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm scanning the chat just to make sure that I haven't missed anyone in case anyone has a question.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, please either raise your hand manually or raise it with the little cartoon hand or put it in the chat. Our speakers would be happy to answer them.
Jen, as we're waiting for people to put a question in, one thing that I thought might be helpful to offer, especially Doug, maybe to answer your question about some of the things that are happening under the dome in terms of some of the issues that we talked about, again, specifically speaking to sexual and reproductive health and access to contraceptive equity. One of the strategies that Missouri Family Health Council has really been employing, especially this session, we have kind of turned to the best defense is a good, or the best defense is a good offensive strategy by continuing just to educate new, not only freshman legislators, but other legislators that are not as educated about what birth control does, how it works, what methods are available, what barriers people are experiencing, the difference between what is an abortifacient, like the mifepristone litigation that's going on, versus a preventive birth control method. And so I would just underscore that there is a lot of, even though it might not touch specific bills or maybe be as dominant under the dome, there's at least a lot of education, fundamental education going on under some of these banners, trying to kind of inoculate against some of the attacks. And that may or may not have had any sort of an effect on some of the attacks on birth control, but we'll certainly continue doing that bipartisan education on some of the sexual and reproductive health specifics that our network can speak to.
Nadine, go ahead. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Just quickly, unless, was it Amy needed to say something? Is that right?
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Okay. I'm just curious about I don't even know the right word for it, but nationally, it seems to me that I'm hearing more and more about Republicans who have a layer of sanity and are trying to work and govern. And as I look at these bills, and mercifully the many that didn't pass, I wonder, is that process also happening within the Missouri legislature? Sometimes I'm heartened by ours, that it feels like there are pragmatic people that want to govern and govern responsibly, but then other things happen, like a lot of these bills and some of the folks who brought them up, the frequent flyers, and I despair. So I mean, is that conversation ongoing about how to rein in the radicalness?
Yeah, I would say both NCJW and MFHC have been pretty successful in terms of working with or educating or meeting folks in the legislature who might be considered strange bedfellows. Part of the work that we do is to educate them about a lot of these hot and button issues that are out there. And, just because a lot of it comes from a place of just not having knowledge. Also, I think in terms of, again, a lot of these sort of very divisive or polarizing issues, there tends to be a trend where the majority party picks a particular issue as their rallying cry for the session or for the year, or frankly, for the electoral cycle. We have seen for the last few sessions that persecuting the trans community has been that issue. And sadly, on that topic, a lot of the legislators will say in private, they don't want to hurt children. They know this is not good legislation, but they are concerned that they will not be reelected if they don't go with the flow and go with their party. While that's very sad to hear, it is still worth talking with those legislators, because we might not be able to get them to move on this issue, but we might be able to work with them on another. So I would say that there is still some sanity under the dome, but you do need to work and develop relationships with those legislators, so that they understand that we and we hope they are coming from a place of trying to do the best for Missourians. That sometimes can be difficult because of term limits, because once you feel like you worked on someone, they're moved on to someplace else. But that is the kind of work that we continue to do. And when we talk about certain bills not passing, I joke that it's primarily because of Senate or legislative dysfunction that they didn't pass, but sometimes it is because they've been convinced to sort of put down that torch for now and not focus on that particular bill, not work on that bill. So a lot of the work with the sane folks, as you might put it, has to do with not moving forward bad legislation. And hopefully we'll come to a point where we are able to work with some of the legislators to move forward good legislation.
Diana, before we go to you, there was a question in the chat from Carol. Is there a way to track deaths of women who needed an abortion but were denied because of Missouri laws? Will there be lawsuits in these cases? Could either Amy or Mandy answer that?
Actually, we were just having this conversation yesterday, because it's very easy to track for our abortion care providers how many they are doing, which they are primarily doing out of state now, but we do not actually have data to track either significant health implications or negative health implications or death because of lack of abortions in Missouri. I don't know at the moment of an organization that actually has been collecting that data, but it would be very interesting to have it.
I would just add, maybe kind of on the periphery of that question, is that fantastic book, which admittedly I have not read, the Turnaway Study, that is kind of speaks not, of course, to Missouri law denial, but generally what happens to women when they are denied access to the abortion care that they need. I would also underscore that you all probably saw in the media a while back the woman in Joplin who was delayed and denied abortion care in an emergency or on kind of the periphery of an emergency situation. And so there has been some findings of help me out, Amy, you probably know more about EMTALA than I do.
Yeah, there was so there is a federal regulation that requires hospitals, I believe that take Medicaid patients to, that requires them to provide emergency services, period. And that hospital in Joplin was investigated. I don't remember the name of the agency, but they were investigated because basically they did not provide, and they were found to not have provided necessary and required emergency medical care to this woman who had to ultimately, I think she went to Kansas and then she ultimately ended up in Illinois, but it was several days after her medical emergency started. So that is at least one documented case that has been investigated. One thing that I believe, and I feel, and this is only anecdotal information, is that hospital systems initially panicked after the Dobbs decision came down, and frankly, OBGYN providers were in a position where before the care that they provided, frankly, wasn't considered an abortion. It was considered miscarriage management, and with Dobbs coming down, a lot of the hospital systems did not know how to approach those kinds of situations where, frankly, the procedure is exactly the same. whether you're terminating a pregnancy because you want to terminate it, or you're terminating it because you have had a medical complication. There has been more education among the medical community now that there is some hope that those kinds of cases will not be as common, especially since this federal investigation has been done to with the hospital in Joplin. So there is some hope in that regard, because while we have an almost complete ban on abortion in Missouri, there is a sort of loophole where if the pregnant person is at risk of like severe and permanent, life-threatening medical, or I guess health damage, that an abortion could be performed. But that entirely puts the burden on the medical provider, and frankly, that medical provider doesn't find out whether or not they were allowed to do the procedure until after their license has been threatened, or they go through whatever kind of penalty process is taken against them. But I will say that thankfully, almost a year out now from the Dobbs decision, a lot of hospital systems are starting to support their medical providers in providing the care that they need to provide for pregnant people.
Do we have any more questions?
Hannah?
Oh, I see Judy Campbell, you have a question? Oh, you're muted, Judy.
Does anybody know why all the DEI bills were finally dropped? I think it was just last week.
Yeah, I mean, my cynical assessment was they were really too busy working on their trying to get their other priorities passed. Notably things like sports betting, where it became a big issue, and now I'm blanking on those other issues, but I kind of got the impression, and Heather might be able to speak to this, but I kind of got the impression that there were higher priorities for them that they were trying to get done, and they ran out of time.
Yeah, I think that's, Judy, are you referring to the budget bills or to the education bills?
Oh, sorry, Judy, you're still muted.
I'll just go ahead and answer for both. So in terms of the budget bills, it became quite clear that that was going to be impossible to implement, as most companies have some sort of DEI policy. And so if the state of Missouri decided that they wouldn't do business with anyone who did, we just wouldn't be doing business. And that was pretty well accepted among most members of the legislature. And I think in terms of the CRT bills and things like that we saw, I think like a lot of their priorities, like IP reform and things like that, as well as tort reform, sports betting, personal property tax repeal, that those all sort of did what they've done every session, and the infighting killed them.
Thanks.
I think I saw Diana Fine had her hand up, but I may have missed her. Diana, are you still on here?
She had to leave.
Oh,
but
we
she
missed her
did,
question.
she did
I'm
put in the
sorry.
chat. She didn't really have a question. She did put in the chat that she wanted to express appreciation to our speakers and also to those who participated in the legislative reception, which we have every January, in which we connect with a lot of legislators. So she just had a comment.
I thought I'm not meaning to cut off anyone else's questions, but I just wanted to leave as a parting thought, because I know a lot of the folks who are on this call, and I know that reproductive freedom is very important for all of you. And there are a number of avenues that organizations like NCJW and Planned Parenthood and Pro-Choice Missouri are working on to try to reinstate true reproductive freedom in Missouri. One of the things that we are learning that is very important is to work on dispelling the negative stereotype or the stigma associated with abortion. So to that end, I think I saw in the chat that the mention of Pro-Choice Missouri's abortion storytellers, or and I believe a number of organizations are trying to get the word out about how very ordinary abortion is, and how necessary it is. And to the extent that you are able to talk to your friends and loved ones about why it's important, to the extent that you have your own stories about needing abortion care, you know, it's a huge step, but it can destigmatize and really humanize the need for access, you know, for all people to the full, the full sort of plate of healthcare. Yeah, and then I will leave it at that. Look at that, I didn't curse.
I just wanted to thank everybody so much for coming, and encourage people to go to our website to find and sign up for the 5 ways to advocate. And anyone can also email Jen Bernstein, which is J Bernstein, BERNSTEIN at ncjw.org, to get, you know, the 5 ways to advocate, or to also, you know, have any questions about NCJW. And Jen is going to send out a link to this presentation. She's also going to, send out a link to the 5 ways to advocate. So thank you everybody so much for coming, and we'll see you next time.